Montgomery County, Maryland, including the participating jurisdictions who have signed on to this process and have engaged with us every step of the way. This plan covers all of the participating communities as well as the overall county and unincorporated areas. So today's meeting, we're going to cover the whole kit and caboodle, the hazard mitigation planning process. We're going to briefly review the hazard identification and risk assessment. We're going to discuss mitigation actions and what those are, as well as addressing any questions and next steps. This is a publicly available open meeting, so we're hoping for community members to join us here today. And if not, this recording will be made available for public review later time as well. So, hazard mitigation planning overview. What is this thing that we're doing here today? So this graphic here, this image, is one way to quantify the disaster cycle. So this is the process that we understand and how we respond to hazard events that occur. We can try and prevent disasters. We can try and be resilient in the face of them, but for the most part, disasters are a part of our life, part of our existence, part of our experience. And so those events, when they occur, there is an immediate moment after there where you have the response, where you are engaging in either life-saving preservation, property protection, that immediate reaction to the disaster event. There is a longer-term recovery process where you try to restore and return to your day-to-day functions. And then this mitigation, this word mitigation again here, is that long after or long before the disaster event moment. And that's where we find ourselves today. This moment of removal from emergency response features where we try to think about what we can do for the future. And what that leads to is the preparation. So as we see with disaster events in the news cycle, we see more and more impactful events happening. We see very costly disasters occurring. And so mitigation, we also see these studies done that every dollar we spend now to protect for the future saves us $6 in the long term. So that's what this whole process is designed to do. It is designed to let us think about disasters and think about what we need for our community and spend that money wisely now so we don't have those worse futures, those worse situations. So when we talk about hazard mitigation, it's the long-term systemic actions that we take now to reduce the impact of future disasters. And why is that important? So across the board, we are looking to protect and to reduce the impact and dangers to people's health, safety, and property. We want to maintain continuity of operations. We want to be able to continue to deliver services and provide the kind of community that we expect to see. We want to save money. We want to spend the money wisely now so we don't lose it later. And also, by participating in this planning process, your community is eligible for future project funding, like the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Assistance family of grants that are noted here before. So it's all about access to that future money, future thinking, trying to plan effectively and plan resiliently for the future. So what are some examples of hazard mitigation? We talk about this, there's many different images that you might see out there online. Typically, we're talking about resiliency in the face of natural hazards in a hazard mitigation plan, but we'll talk about all the kinds of hazards that have been profiled as part of this planning process. We're talking about elevating or demolishing structures that flood frequently, so removal of homes from the floodplain. We're talking about strengthening or burying power lines, increasing the size of culverts so those floodwaters can pass through more easily, to reinforcing buildings to withstand high winds and hurricanes, to installing generators, which sort of falls into that burying power lines conversation around increasing our electrical stability, creating those defensible spaces around buildings to reduce wildfires. So when there is wildfire, that it doesn't come up to our structures, and then strategically placing ground vegetation to help capture water where it falls. So all of these are just examples, ideas to get the juices flowing, not a comprehensive list of what mitigation can look like or all the kinds of hazards that we can mitigate, but just an idea of what we talk about when we're talking about long-term systemic changes that can reduce impacts to the future. So this is a snapshot of what the planning process and what the chapters of the plan cover as well. So we've gone through a process with our community representatives, the representatives of our official governing bodies, to establish that internal planning team. We've gone through a hazard identification and risk assessment. We've identified vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure, and we're into that mitigation strategy, that future resiliency, those specific actions that we want to take to protect for the future. Moving into the next month, we're going to start having the state and federal review of this hazard mitigation planning process, where it will go and get comments on based off of the local hazard mitigation planning policy guidance from FEMA, where we have to check a bunch of boxes and make sure that we're meeting all of our expectations. And then once that comes back, the communities will adopt the plan, and we'll move forward into a 5-year eligibility cycle, where once we've got that approved plan, we are eligible to apply for future funding and can move into the future. It is a 5-year plan, so it has to be updated every 5 years. And so we revisit this plan often to sort of look back at what has changed and what we can expect for the future. The specific pieces of the plan, as it goes through the chapters, profiles the community and key assets, describes those hazards and the impacts to the community. There's lots of maps, and I'm going to show some of those here today to review the hazards that we've identified, and also where they overlap with that built environment, where we can see some of those additional impacts coming. And then we take, again, identify and prioritize actions that the community can take to reduce the identified risk. And then obviously eligible for those grant funds. So for both our community participants and our community representatives, we have a survey out available on the county's website. The draft 2023 plan is up now. By the time we adopt and get through the review process, it will be the 2024 plan. So you might see interchangeably the 2024 plan or 2023 plan. By the time we get to the end of this process, it will be the 2024 plan consistently. There is a survey and the link to the draft plan available online. So please do take the time to go and visit that website to look at the draft plan and complete the survey. Are there any questions or comments to this point? I'm going to move into some mapping after this, and I want to make sure I can capture anything if anybody wants to speak now.
Question for you. It's Matt from Montgomery County OEM.
Yes, sir.
So I know in the past, in previous hazard mitigation plans, there was one of the surveys, there was some talk about putting some context about certain risk and how people perceive risk.
Yes.
We've noticed that in some situations, people will tend to prioritize certain events if it's in recent memory.
Yes.
Is there been anything to change that? And so, like, you say, hey, you know, how do you rank cybersecurity? And oh, by the way, the county sees like 80,000 attempted intrusions a day. How do you rank flooding? You know, what do you think of flooding? And by the way, you know, there were 29 water rescue calls last year in the county. Numbers like that. Has that been added to the survey for this year?
So if you're talking about public perception, there was a survey at the beginning. We've had several. This is the third survey that we released. So there were 2 other comment periods where we were collecting public participation. In the first survey, we asked the community members to rank their 3 highest man-made and human-caused hazards, to describe what kind of impacts they've seen in their lifetime or in their time living in the county, and to describe how that's impacted them in their lives. The thing about a hazard mitigation plan is that we utilize best available data. So when we pull that data, we're pulling from national data sets, from county quantities, from regional data sets, from surveys and mapping efforts. And we're trying to collect, again, the best available data that's available to us. But sometimes there's a gap between the data sets that we have and the lived experience. And so the hazard mitigation plan attempts to sort of combine these to get a quantitative and a qualitative perspective. the people who are living and experiencing the community in Montgomery County are going to be better experts than people who live, you know, many hundreds of miles away and are looking at just data points on a spreadsheet. So both are valuable and should be integrated consistently. So one way to answer that question is when we talk about natural hazards, we are looking at what those data sets tell us, like what has happened in the past before. And we also sort of attempt to quantify the hazard based off of the monetary value that you could lose on that bad day. So when we look at like the flood maps, we'll look at and see where those flood plains go and where your important structures exist. How much would it cost to replace that important structure if it was to be washed away entirely? And so if you review the hazard mitigation plan, there are sections and chapters in each of the hazards where we quantify the potential loss and the risk from that hazard. And then at the end, there is a vulnerability and risk assessment piece that sort of ranks them all and shows you whether or not it is of a high mindset and whether or not it's at the forefront of your mind. What do we objectively see as a higher hazard compared to others? The other piece of that too, while we are quantifying all of those data pieces, is that when we mitigate, public perception and public will are really important. Your community members may feel like one hazard is more impactful to them than others because they are impacted, because you know, every time you try to get out of your driveway, you're driving through that puddle and it's scraping up the roadway and they're seeing it, and their neighbor got flooded 3 times last year, and they are feeling those kinds of impacts. So even though we may sort of quantify a hazard as maybe being of a higher risk, we should always be aware of what the community is feeling and where those pain points are as well. And that's also part of this public participation piece, is if the community is feeling that pain, we want to make sure we're pursuing projects that help them out as well. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, it does.
Any other questions before we move on into the mapping section? Wonderful. I love the conversation is always fabulous. Okay, so hazard identification and risk assessment, and what does this look like? So we have some profiled natural hazards and profiled other hazards. When we're looking at these kinds of hazards, there are under the FEMA HMA grant program, we have natural hazards as an eligibility criteria. So natural hazards is where we're going to be focused on applying for that HMA grant funding. Other hazards are not required. They're not going to fall under that checkbox of hazards. And also in some of these situations, when we talk about other hazards that have been sort of removed from that natural hazard picture, we can sometimes see cascading impacts. So we've talked about that with the community, about how a flood can then impact transportation accidents. I need to look at these because I don't think these are precisely accurate. I think we pulled this slide from something else. I apologize. So now that I'm looking at this again, the profiled hazards will appear slightly different in your hazard mitigation plan, as these other hazards have not been profiled here. These other hazards have been identified for possible cascading or possible other impacts. But anyway, we'll get that fixed and straightened up when we post this to the public website. That'll be accurate to your community hazards. This is accurate to your community picture. And when we look back at what has changed over the last 5 years and are projecting into the future about what we expect to see, we get sort of a trend, and we can start seeing the kinds of changes that have occurred and what we want to see and what we can expect to account for moving into the future. So I've pulled out here just a quick little snapshot as far as development goes. And when we say best available data, we have a snapshot of the residential development in 2005, and a snapshot of residential development in 2020. We did the same thing for commercial development, and this was the more impactful picture. We consistently see population growth in Montgomery County, and population growth that accounts for a huge portion of the state's growth as well. Montgomery County is continuing to grow as we speak. And so over this 15-year period, the increase in townhomes, 373%, increase in apartments, 233%. So we're seeing growth and we're seeing this kind of development. And so as we look to the future, we want to make sure that those hazards are being considered as in addition to your development. So if we're developing, we're developing safely, we're not increasing our risk. Combined with that is the social vulnerability. So this is a tool that has been developed by the CDC. There are 16 variables that are bundled into these 4 categories here. This is one way of trying to identify where our natural hazards could adversely impact populations that may be more at risk than others. An easy one to think about is, if you've got a grandma who doesn't use her cell phone very well, or has trouble getting to vehicles. If we were to have an emergency evacuation situation, could they easily get to their vehicle? Do they have a vehicle? Are they able to transport? Would they be additionally at risk if power went out? And so communities that meet these criteria, this is one way of quantifying it. The CDC's Social Vulnerability Index, SVI score, is on a scale from 0 to 1, with 1 being increased risk. And when we look at the map of Montgomery County, these darker blue areas is where we see that increased risk. So these are communities that might need additional support or additional alert notification, or there is a need there, an unmet need that we can start to look at and seeing how to bridge that gap. So the hazards, the mitigation actions to our hazards identified in the Hazard Mitigation Plan take into account some of this. The community profiled actions from the 2021 Climate Resiliency Plan also address this to a certain extent. And so this is all in an effort to try and meet the needs of your community where your community is. Any questions on this? The community profile aspect. Okay, so hazard maps. This is a selection of some of the hazard mapping to sort of describe to you some of the graphics that appear, the hazards that have been profiled, and maybe some of the limitations as well. And you'll see that here in this next slide. So this is, again, like a very zoomed out picture of the FEMA NFIP floodplain. So when we talk about flood and flood hazard in hazard mitigation, best available data, FEMA will, and FIMA, identify the floodway, where the water is, where it flows under the bridge every day when you go to work. That's the floodway. The floodplain, that 1% annual chance. And when we say that 1% annual chance, what that means is every time the thunderstorm moves in, a roll of the dice, 100-sided die, and that 1% annual chance, that relatively bad day, is where we expect the water to spill over into the floodplain. So the floodplain is where that water is going to go on your fairly average bad day. You can go several years without that 1% annual rainfall coming, or you can go through 1 year and get 3 storms that roll through with that 1% chance. Every time the thunderstorms comes through, that's that roll of that die. The gold extensions there are on the very bad day, the 0.2% annual chance of flooding, that 500-year floodplain, where we know the water will go on that very bad day, but it is not as frequently. You can also have 1,000-year flood events, and you can have 1,000-year flood events 3 years in a row. But these are sort of where we expect the water to go between the floodway and the floodplains. The limitation of this map is it does not capture where stormwater is flowing. So when the rain falls and flows through your drainage systems that are pre-made, what we've talked about previously through this planning process is we're seeing like a bathtub effect, that the water shooting in from all of these different areas is starting to fill back up into your built environment. And so that hazard is not going to get captured on this kind of a mapping. I'll take this opportunity to sort of further one of the mitigation actions that were identified in this hazard mitigation planning process, which is to say, if you are purchasing a home in this turquoise blue area, your mortgage lender will require you to get flood insurance. It's a requirement. You can't get a mortgage without a flood insurance policy. If you're outside in this sort of more green gold color, the outside of the floodplain, you are not required to get flood insurance, but you can still get a policy, and it will be much cheaper than if you were in the floodplain. So FEMA quantifies a flood as a body of water moving across two parcels. And if you are not in a required mandatory floodplain, but you do or are concerned about flood in your area, flood insurance might be something to look into, because it can be a protection, a rather cheap protection that can help you and at least maybe make you feel a little bit more secure as an option. So this is one map that talks about flood hazard. For more information, please do review that the flood section of the hazard mitigation plan. Is talking about wildfire risk. Now, wildfire and urban fire are two different things, not to say that you can't have fire in your urban areas. This is just talking about how the built environment and the natural environment sort of overlap, and where that overlap can create that wildfire hazard or that section hazard. There are other maps in the plan that talk about wildfire and can talk about sort of what your risk looks like, but this is just one snapshot to show where that overlap between built environment and wildfire can sort of cause additional risk or hazard. So when we talk about defensible space, and I'll answer your question in just a minute, what we're thinking about is old growth woods or wood piles or places where those bushes have grown up right up to the house. And the defensible space is where you're creating space between that vegetation and your home, about 4 feet, although it could be more, up to 20 feet, so that should a wildfire be started in the vegetation and going through vegetation, that you've got space to protect you from that kind of a forest fire. Yes, question.
This, just to confirm, this is your interpretation of the wildland-urban interface from Montgomery County, correct?
Yes, based off of, and we have some citations down here, and I can't read the little tiny.
I'm interested in to see where what data set you pulled this from, because I'm our GIS analyst for the office, and I would like to have a copy of this and
Sure.
editable polygon. So I'll link up with you after this. This is interesting.
Absolutely. This is from the U.S. Forest Service, based off of data collected between 1990 and 2020. So absolutely, this will be available to you. And we have, for the people, members of the planning team, all of the mapping efforts are available through our shared site. And all of these maps do appear in your hazard mitigation plan. But absolutely, for those more data heavy pieces, we can connect after this process. Okay.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. So here is another way to capture hazards and hazard impacts. Obviously, we can't tell you where a tropical storm is going to go. It's going to go wherever it's going to go, but we can capture and show where they have been. So not to say that they can't cut right through the heart of Montgomery County, but here is the identification of tropical storm events, hurricane events that have come through and come close, if not directly through. Even though you're not getting maybe a direct impact, I'm certain you may have seen some other cascading impacts from these storms that have come through. So this is sort of a quantification of the last 40 years of hurricane hazards in your area. Similar to this is again, a quantification of your earthquake events. An earthquake, you'll see in the hazard mitigation plan, is a minimal risk to the county based off of your geography and topography, minimal risk. A limitation, again, with this kind of a map, also we should point out, is that most of these events occurred sort of around the same time period. We see like a big chunk that all happened in 2019. There's a couple here scattered from 2010. And to some of our community members that experienced an event in 2011, that is not captured on this map. And that could be because, one, there was no seismograph to capture that shaking at that time, or it didn't reach to that magnitude. There is a disconnect between the lived experience and the data that we're able to capture. And we talk about that in the hazard mitigation plan. So these kinds of data sets, they can be limited. They can fail to capture something that we do experience, but we're doing our best to sort of capture that and talk about it and the overlap. And so wherever we fall short with the data set, we sort of narratively describe that in the hazard mitigation plan. And if we aren't capturing something that should be captured, that is part of the lived experience of your community, we'd like to put that in the plan as well. And finally, just to give you an example of some of the other kinds of maps that occur here, this is a snap from the dams, levees, and the risk areas associated with those communities. Okay, mitigation actions. Any questions so far about the hazards or the mapping that has been done so far? Okay, so arguably, oh yes, sir. Oh, I think you're on mute, sir. I'll see you as muted. I'm trying to see if I can unmute you. You are. Go ahead.
Okay. The question is the scale of these maps expandable so we can see some pretty fine detail? We're a pretty small number of square miles, you know, of the county, so you know, short distances could be critical here.
We have some maps that are zoomed in to like sort of the quadrant of the community, but I'd say anything that you want at a closer scale or a finer detail, let us know and we can put those together for you.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Tina.
Just a question from the chat. Heather's asking, because FEMA has issued new preliminary firms, will they be reflected in this plan? They may not be final yet, but they may be more accurate than the 2006 ones.
I believe the firms that were delivered to the community members are not publicly available yet because you're still in the comment period. So I do not believe what we were able to pull at this moment would reflect what you saw in those mapping efforts. I do know that the community is engaged in additional flood hazard mapping outside of this hazard mitigation planning process. So it's likely that when that process is completed, it'll capture those new maps as well. But no, not at this time. Is there anything else from the chat or questions from the
Bill mentioned that there is a on FEMA's website, they have changed a bit on how they determine risk and the cost of flood insurance. So he shared the National Flood Insurance link in the chat.
And is that relating to the risk rating 2.0 changes?
Yes, it is.
Awesome.
That they changed that in October, I think 2021, but the changes are slow to roll out to affect everyone. The one point to note, distance or proximity to the floodplain is only one of many factors now. That used to be the sole factor. and you could expect better deals on flood insurance based on proximity outside of the floodplain. You shouldn't expect that in the future.
And there are community representatives like Bill here, who is your floodplain coordinator and floodplain administrator, who can answer additional questions on floodplain concerns for your community specific.
And we also have Heather she's the City of Rockville floodplain administrator as well.
Wonderful. So for questions and concerns, the experts of your community are the people to go back to. Items. All right, I'm going to move into the mitigation action section. Arguably, when we talk about the mitigation planning process, while it encompasses a lot of different features, the mitigation actions are sort of the heart. They're the reason. They're the most important piece of this planning process. So the hazard mitigation plan identifies potential actions that the community may choose to pursue, and it acts as a menu of options that can be selected from. So the idea behind this hazard mitigation planning process is that we comprehensively think about anything and everything that could go wrong in the form of natural hazards, and we identify specific and measurable stepping stones to help take us towards those resiliency goals. But they can be a wide variety of actions that may not all be completely accomplishable in a 5-year period. There are more than 100 proposed actions articulated in the draft, and no one is saying that all of them need to be done over the next 5-year period. They're just simply when a problem does arise, or when money, or when attention and focus and need comes up, you have a list pre-prepared, ready to pull out and figure out what might be the right solution for this particular instance. So some highlights from the mitigation actions. We have 48 that overlapped with natural hazard impacts from the Montgomery County Climate Resiliency Plan. These included a wide variety of different topics, but typically were identified in the Climate Action Plan as having a natural hazard overlay. And then other identified plans, either identified in the 2021 Climate Resiliency Plan or identified through this planning process, include things like backup power solutions at critical facilities, implementing electrical grid hardening activities. We have some water resiliency plans as well, strengthening water treatment facilities in county municipal buildings, increasing public awareness across the board for hazards is always a vital component. Public awareness, public participation is important for making a whole community approach and developing a plan and actions and steps that are applicable and helpful for your community members. Also included were limiting development in the floodplain, restoring and protecting or increasing these kinds of natural vegetation that can help with that sequestering of water and carbon. And then also, again, providing education material to the public regarding disaster risk, emergency alerts, and the importance of flood insurance. So that's the overview of the plan and planning process. This is sort of like the summary piece. Any questions on what has come so far? As far as next steps go, we have the draft plan. Again, we have it out and available for review now. There are final incorporation pieces that need to happen. We have the public survey comment period open for another week from today in order to collect any feedback, ideas, suggestions, comments, critiques, anything along those lines. We want anyone and everyone who is interested and willing to pay attention to give us their feedback on the plan, anything we're missing, anything along those lines. Over the next 2 weeks, we'll work on incorporating everything that we've received from the community and integrating everything back into the hazard mitigation plan, and then turning it over to the state. We're currently targeting mid-November for submission to the state for review. We anticipate the state and federal review process to take approximately 4 months. It could be shorter than that, but typically that's what we see in that review process. With full adoption of the hazard mitigation plan before your current plan expires in April. That's the plan. And honestly, that's everything we have for you here today. Thank you for your participation in this entire planning process. We've taken one whole year to complete what we've done so far to date. And I really appreciate your attendance and participation in this meeting as well. I do see some questions, and I will take additional comments and questions at this time. Go ahead.
Chelsea, I
Yes,
just wanted to say thank you for making us all more aware of all the issues that we should be cognizant of, and for doing such a thorough job. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it. It's been an honor to be a partner with you in this process in developing the planning. So I appreciate your time and attention as well. I did see another hand go up. Great. If anyone needs to get in contact with me, my email is, I think, everywhere on most of the planning material, or you can say as much in the chat and I can email you back. Ihsan Baldour is the county's point of contact. Tina or Ihsan, did you either want to say something at this moment?
Sure. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any question regarding the draft, or I put the Hazard Mitigation Plan webpage link in the chat. You can go through like the survey and look at it. And please feel free, if you have any questions, reach out to me or Tina, or I can just forward your questions to Chelsea, and just try to keep the good work for our community. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The recording of today's meeting, as well as the updated slide deck, will be posted on our team site, and we'll have that available also on the website as soon as possible. And again, the draft plan and the survey to provide your feedback is available online. Please send an email if you have any issues or questions that either don't fit into the survey, or if you just want to have a quick conversation or discuss anything in particular. And then that final draft plan will also be available once we've incorporated everything and sent it out for state review as well. So thank you all for your time and attention, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chelsea.